This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Karina Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Karina Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Now joining us in studio is Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
Thank you for coming back. We appreciate it.
What is the AG's role in investigating the 250 absentee ballots that were found in an Amazon delivery? What can you tell us about that?
Well, it is under investigation, and we are working with the Secretary of State's office to get to the bottom of what it is that happened so that there can be a robust, complete summary for folks to understand what happened. But that is still underway. There are still threads to pull. We're working with the Secretary of State, and to the extent that there's any other law enforcement agency that might be involved, we'll be working with them as well.
Do you anticipate having results this year, or do you know?
I don't know. I mean, the investigation will take as long as it takes. I would like to see it come to fruition sooner rather than later, because I know that Mainers are interested in any information that can be provided by the Secretary of State's office, by my office, by those who may have been involved. And to the extent that transparency is important to confirm that our elections are indeed safe, secure, and accessible, I'd like to see it wrap up sooner rather than later. But again, what's also important about any investigation is that it run its full course. So what I can provide is I hope it's soon, but I don't want to rush it either, because I don't want to get to a place where maybe we miss something or we inappropriately categorize something as happening when it didn't.
What do you say to critics that state that the Secretary of State's office is investigating themselves?
Well, I think that those critics maybe aren't looking more fully at how these investigations typically play out. We have sworn law enforcement officers who, they're not elected, they're not from some party, and their job is really just to chase down the evidence, chase down the facts. To give you an example, in cases that my office has been involved with when it comes to maybe voting irregularities in the past, we get a complaint that comes in. We have sworn law enforcement that investigate what happened, look at the evidence, collect any materials that might have some suggestion as to what happened, interview witnesses that might be involved. Maybe it was a register or clerk. Maybe it was the individual themselves who maybe didn't vote or had voted twice or what happened. So we get to the bottom of what happened to determine whether or not there's something actionable that needs to be addressed. There's nothing that, at least I'm aware of, that's any different here than how any other investigation, criminal or civil. To be clear, this isn't just about, is something criminal happening? This isn't just about, why do these ballots get in the box? The investigation will cover the circumstances. And it is the Secretary of State's office working with the Attorney General's office, working with other agencies, whether they be state or federal, to make sure that all of the leads are chased down. And this is done without concern for politics or partisanship. It's really about concern for making sure that the system that has been constructed for how Mainers vote continues to provide safe, secure, transparent, accessible elections. That's really what the focus is, because that's what Republicans, Democrats, unenrolleds need. When critics are thinking about this, I hope they'll take into account that it is regular that the state of Maine, that local law enforcement agency, a municipal sheriff, there will be complaints that come in that need to be chased down. We have very well-trained law enforcement officials, officers that are able to chase down all these leads. And at the conclusion of that investigation, some sort of appropriate transparency will be provided as to what happened. I can also guarantee this, where things went right, where things went wrong, it's going to be important for everybody to know about that. The Secretary has provided some information already from her perspective about what's been going on, which I understand was an effort to give the public some information, but I also understand that the public does benefit to have confirmed that this is a multi-party effort and to ensure that folks can trust that the voting that's happening right now in Maine is safe, secure, and is going to have an accurate tally at the end.
Well, let's pivot to the Citizen's Guide to the Referendum Election that was developed with the Secretary of State. Can you tell us about this?
As I hope everybody knows, we do have an election. If you're voting absentee, it's happening right now. There are 2 questions on the ballot. These are citizen-initiated questions. One has to do with certain restrictions on voting. One has to do with what's called red flag, or creating an opportunity for families to try to get gun restriction orders on individuals. These are 2 questions that have been put on the ballot that voters are going to be voting on this November. It's an off-season election. You might not be thinking about it because there's no presidential candidate, there's no gubernatorial candidate, there's no senatorial candidate, but these are important questions. And so every time there is a question that is put on the ballot, the Office of the Attorney General provides a nonpartisan legal review of what the questions would do. So right now, there may be folks that they might know that they have a city councilor who's going to be up for election or a school board member. I hope they do. I want people out voting. I want them being engaged in their communities. But if they are just now tuning in to the fact that there are 2 questions on the ballot and they're wondering what those citizen-initiated questions would do, there is a Maine Citizens Guide to Referendum Election that is available through the Secretary of State's website. It does have not only the questions, but also what my office has provided for a nonpartisan legal assessment of what the question would do so that folks can determine whether or not they want to vote yes or they want to vote no. It's just a way to get some information that is not filtered through a particular ask. That's not to say that folks should disregard what the people knocking on their door or their signs or Maine public, for example, recently just had a debate between the proponents of question 2 versus the opponents of question 2. So there's a bunch of different ways people can get information about what these questions might do. But if you're really looking for the language of the questions, if you're really looking for the legal assessment from the Attorney General's office as to how the question would play out, the Maine Citizens Guide to Referendum Election is available on the Secretary of State's website. It's available today. You can go take a look at it and make your own decision about what vote you want to make on question 1 and question 2.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a discussion with Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey.
As you're aware of, we all have personal opinions. What is yours on referendum 1 and 2?
So as Aaron Frey, on question 1, I'm voting no. I actually think that Maine's system of absentee ballot access and voting has been calibrated. It is safe. It is secure. It ensures that those individuals who need to access the ballot because they work, because they're disabled, because they don't have access to a physical polling place, that they can get their ballots, delivered to them, and then there's a way in which it's going back. I think our system is working well. And I, as somebody who's had the opportunity to see how elections work, I have not seen any evidence that question 1 is needed to solve a problem. Everybody is supposed to show their ID when they register to vote, and then there's a system of checks and balances in place. You have to give your name, and you have to sign off. Like if it's absentee, you have to make sure you provide the right address, and you sign off on the ballot. There's a number of different things that a person has to do when they're voting absentee or when they're voting and they're getting their ballot. In the absence of any problem that question 1 would solve, with my concern that passing this would make it harder for people who deserve to have access to the ballot. It would make it hard for them to do that. And again, I'm thinking specifically those who work and maybe can't just take off on the one Tuesday that's available to be there in person, those who are disabled and are not able to get out but need either to have the ballot delivered to them or have a third party help get that ballot back to the clerk. I just have not been convinced. And trust me, I work at an office where we do prosecute every instance, every question of voter fraud. So I just don't see question 1 as being necessary. So I'm not persuaded. I'm going to be voting no on 1. With respect to question 2, that's a little bit harder. I'm very sensitive to what happened in Lewiston and how that provided a very clear example of where, had there been a red flag, and I'm assuming that listeners understand that red flag is really a short way of describing a family's ability to go to court to get an order when they're concerned about a family member's mental state or concerned about certain statements that maybe a family member has made that suggest that they're going to engage in some violence and they have access to guns. A red flag is the family's ability to go to get a court order that would prohibit that family member from possessing firearms for a limited period of time. And this is versus a yellow flag, which is what Maine has now. And what yellow flag is sort of shorthand for is if there's a concern about an individual, either their mental health or certain statements they're making about violence, somebody would call police and the police would engage in a process where they go, they secure the person, they have the person assessed for whether or not they do pose a risk of harm to others, and then they would get a court to sign off on an order that would prohibit firearms for a temporary period of time while the individual got the help that they might need to get on the other side of their making the statements or whatever mental health crisis they have. So Maine has the yellow flag now. Question 2 is about, is there a red flag? The Lewiston example, going back to where I started, that was an example of where law enforcement had the opportunity to do something, to engage in the yellow flag process, and they didn't. more specific in that case, law enforcement did sort of leave it to the family to say, hey, look, it's on you to make sure that this person doesn't have their guns. Go in, take them out of the safe. It's on you to do it. But the family didn't have the same opportunity that law enforcement had to get a court order that would deprive their family member that they were concerned about. So in that case, would family have maybe been able to do something that law enforcement apparently wasn't able to do? Could that have made a difference? The short answer is yes. On the other side, I guess what I'm struggling with is I don't want to create a situation where it's just left to the family now because that option's available to the family. So law enforcement says, well, look, the family, they can go get a red flag if they want. So we'll just let them deal with it and go from there. And of course, as you've heard the discussion, there's concern about the due process that might be involved with red flag versus what Maine has now with the yellow flag. And the other thing that weighs on my consideration is up until October of 2023, the yellow flag process really wasn't used that much. I don't know if it's ever been landed on as to the why it hadn't been used very frequently, but it just wasn't. After October of 2023, we saw a marked increase in the utilization of yellow flag to address circumstances that if somebody is making statements that they might harm somebody else and has access to guns, or is experiencing a mental health crisis and is posing a risk to others and has access to guns, we've seen law enforcement using yellow flags. So do I think that having another tool in the toolbox that does involve a court, do I think that that's a bad idea? Not necessarily, because again, we have seen where law enforcement did not engage. The but is I'm also sensitive to what might happen if we sort of have couple of different processes that one is relying on the other to use, and it just sort of takes the motivation off of one or the other because they're waiting for somebody else to do it. So that's a long way to say, as I sit here right now, I'm not sure if I'm checking yes or no. I know how important it is. The other thing too, by the way, is I do understand that access to firearms is not only dangerous to other people, but it's also for somebody who might be experiencing an interest in self-harm. Access to firearms is by far the way in which we see firearm violence in the state, of individuals using firearms against themselves. If there are ways that we don't have right now in which family can engage to remove the firearm from possession of an individual who really needs to have it removed for a short period of time, that's not a bad thing. For those that are sort of wondering how they might quantify this, this is at least one way in which I'm trying to think through how I'm going to end up voting on this.
What I'm also hearing from opponents is that a neighbor could initiate the red flag. Is that your understanding?
Well, it wouldn't be a neighbor. It would be like a roommate. Really, the way in which the red flag question has been developed, it's about somebody that has a familial relationship, a domestic relationship, and by domestic, not only boyfriend, girlfriend, or former husband, former wife, but also if you're a roommate. You wouldn't necessarily be a family member if you were a roommate, but that's a little bit more than a neighbor. Really, the family or roommate, the idea is that it's somebody who has enough of a reason to know what this person is like. And so it's not the postal carrier, it's not the neighbor, it's not somebody walking the dog past a house and they think they see something and they can go get a court order. It really, the way in which who can petition the court for this is about family, household member, which would be either family by blood, family by marriage, or like a roommate.
So some of the concerns that I've heard out there is if a family member doesn't report it and this person goes out and shoots somebody or does something, can they go after that family member who didn't report it and civil suit them?
Something like that would create an additional piece of evidence that an attorney might use to try to create liability against the family. So, I mean, the liability could be there now. If a family member or household member or roommate, if they bought the gun for somebody and they had reason to know that the person probably shouldn't have a gun, there'd be a liability today, regardless of whether or not it was a red flag, yellow flag, etc. If somebody has guns and they're acting up and they don't call police, that could create a theory of liability, although there's no mandatory requirement that a family member call law enforcement if they think a family member is acting up. But still, from a civil liability standpoint, if somebody knows that somebody else is potentially dangerous, that could at least create litigation. So going to your point, David, if red flag passes and there's evidence that shows that family knew that they had a family member who had access to guns, who was making statements that they were going to shoot something up, or they were experiencing a mental health crisis that was going to put others at risk if there's no intervention, if they knew that and then didn't go do everything that they could do to try to intervene, call police, try to activate red flag. Because, by the way, they could activate red flag and the court might deny it. It would be something that I expect would get some attention in the event of somebody who maybe should have had either law enforcement or family raise the issue and didn't. If red flag does pass, I think we're going to see that come up. Again, when I sort of come back to this, I just think about how, for Maine, the very public instance was where law enforcement had an opportunity to do something, the family didn't. Family was left to do something but didn't have the power to do it. Red flag would give them that power that, in this case, the family didn't have to intervene. Again, that's that struggle with, you want enough tools in the toolbox to make sure that all those who care about people who are maybe not at the best place, who are experiencing a low point in their life where they feel like committing harm to themselves or others, you sort of want to make sure that there's every tool available. And that's sort of what I think about. Recognizing that as long as the court is involved, there's going to be access to due process by somebody who maybe has an order against them. Again, that's just my back and forth. I might vote early because I want to make sure I don't get busy on a Tuesday and can't get in there on election day. I'm still thinking very hard about what might make the most sense for Maine right now. Because the other thing, by the way, I do have a sense as to the yellow flag orders coming in, and there was some very concerning activity that is leading Mainers to call to say that their family members are, in a bad place. And so I sort of been able to see how yellow flag has been activated and why. And it has been important to have the ability to temporarily limit access to firearms to folks who are just not in a good place, or making statements that are very concerning. Recognizing that that's of value, that's sort of how I'm thinking about whether or not adding red flag is going to be important.
So the AG's office, you're notified of the yellow flag when it's activated?
Law enforcement is able to keep track of what's reported in and how yellow flag is used, because there is a tracking of how yellow flag is used. It's a way in which to, in some ways, ensure accountability when you're interfering with firearm rights, that it's not an undue interference, or that you have a sense as to how law enforcement agencies across the state are using this, because we are a law enforcement agency at the AG's office, as well as wearing a bunch of other hats. But we do get information. It's limited, but it at least gives a sense as to what circumstances are activating it being used. You're like, geez, Aaron, I wish you just told me yes or no, like how you're going to vote on these things, right? Go to the Citizens Guide. I want to make that other plug, because there's nothing wrong with being informed when you go to vote. In fact, it really is part of what our job is as a citizen, is to, A, be engaged, right? Democracy's hard, and that means we have to do work to make it work. And I want folks to vote. Maine has a history and a good tradition of getting out and voting and registering how you feel about referendum questions, about who's running, about who's on your school board, who's in your city council. These are all very important votes, and we know that because we see that in the news all the time. So if you're wondering about how to vote on question 2, if you want to check me on question 1 to see how you feel about how I just said I would vote on question 1, go to the Citizens Guide that's available through the Secretary of State's website. Look at what these questions are, and look at the nonpartisan, apolitical, legal description of what these questions would do, so that you can make up your own mind about what makes the most sense for you when you go vote in this coming election.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a discussion with Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey.
So last time we talked, we know that you're involved in some lawsuits. Where do we stand on those?
Some lawsuits, yeah. We have 36 that Maine is involved with directly right now. We have about 32 that are multi-state that Maine is collaborating with other attorneys general offices across the Democratic attorneys general. I stress that because I recognize some folks might say, well, you're only working with Democrats. I would love to work with Republicans on this. The kinds of things that we are litigating over, they're not just hurting Democrats. They're hurting Republicans. They're hurting unenrolled. They're hurting children. They're hurting those who are more senior. When you have important research that is being defunded because the President of the United States and his administration are changing the rules of the road, different from what Congress required, that's hurting Texas A&M just like it's hurting the University of Maine. So why the Texas Attorney General is not stepping in to litigate over the inappropriate redirection of research funds, I don't understand. But that's a long way to get to. There's 32 cases, and they cover a bunch of different things. It covers funding that's frozen, funding that inappropriate conditions are being put on that Congress didn't require, but now the federal government is separate from Congress. It's where certain programming is being interfered with. In some cases, it's substantive rights, so birthright citizenship, voting. There was an executive order that had the federal government interfering with certain voting. processes. So there are 4 cases that the state of Maine is engaged in on its own, 2 in which the state of Maine brought against the federal government, 2 that the federal government, the Department of Justice, has brought against Maine. One was the USDA case in which the USDA withheld funding from feeding school children, 170,000 school children, because the federal government said that we were not following Title IX the way we should. We disagreed. We believe that we're following Title IX. We believe it's inappropriate to discriminate against transgender student female athletes. So we took that to court, and we almost immediately got an order that confirmed that the state of Maine was acting lawfully, that the USDA was acting unlawfully. It didn't address the root issue of what Title IX requires. I want to be clear about that. What the USDA case did do is it said the federal government, you have to follow process in order to strip funding from a state. And the USDA didn't follow any legal process. There's a second case in which we are being sued by the federal government around Title IX. That's working its way through the system right now. But as we stand here right now, there's no one way or the other about where that is. We have the case in which the federal government sued the Secretary of State for Maine, trying to get access to very sensitive voter information. By the way, this isn't just like who's registered to vote. This is a bunch of different personal information that all of us, assuming we're all registered, that the federal government wants access to. We are litigating over how much the federal government gets to database a bunch of different information that may or may not be appropriate for them to have from state voter records. And then there's a fourth case in which we're litigating over funding that was so important for helping with alternative energy in Maine. There were some grants that were cut, and so we sued directly to have those restored. So that's the 32 multi-state cases that Maine is directly involved with. And we're seeing some success. I don't know if you probably follow that at the federal district court level, at the federal circuit court level. We have judges who are appointed by Republican presidents, judges appointed by Democratic presidents, going all the way back. We're talking H.W. Bush and Clinton and W. Bush and Obama and Biden and Trump. Judges who are appointed by all manner of president are agreeing that there are rights that are being violated by the federal government when Democratic attorneys general are bringing suit. The Supreme Court has been a little less categorical. In some ways, it's been like a shell game. We're not getting a clear answer as to what the law requires, but the Supreme Court's saying, well, the case is going to keep pending, but we're not going to allow the emergency relief to stand, or the case was filed in the wrong court, so you have to go refile it in a different court. It's not saying that what the states are doing is wrong. It's not saying that what the federal government doing is right, but the Supreme Court is not providing us direction that would be helpful during this time in which there's a concern about how the Trump administration is acting with respect to the law. Let me add one more thing, because I think anybody listening to this might just be like, Aaron, we know you're a Democrat. We know you just want to sue Donald Trump. I really don't. And I may have even said this on the last show. There's a lot of other work that we might be able to focus on if we didn't have to deal with what are significant violations to what Maine should be expecting that Congress has directed, programs that have been legislated. And what sort of gets me about this is Congress, the majority in Congress in particular, is very willing to work with President Trump on programming that President Trump wants to see happen. We saw that in the One Big Beautiful Bill, where there were programs that were going to be cut, there was money that was going to be redirected, and the Republican majority in Congress worked with Donald Trump and his administration to make that happen. So this isn't about the president not getting what he wants. It's about the president having to engage in a constitutional democratic process in order to change programs that he doesn't like, in order to redirect funding that he thinks Congress should not have sent out to different states. So there's a way to do it, and the president just isn't doing it right. So once the president starts doing it right, either he's going to be told, no, we want the money to keep going to these programs. Congress still wants healthcare or research, or maybe Congress doesn't want tariffs in the same way that the president does, because the tariff power is with Congress and Congress should be stepping in on that. But until we have the president engaging with Congress on programs that Congress directed the president to administer, then that just means that the check and balance is going to have to be states like Maine going to court and saying, you know what, I think that our Republican, Democratic, unenrolled citizens are being harmed, men, women, and children, when the federal government isn't going through the process it should be going through in order to redirect funding or change programs.
Thank you for joining us for Part 1 with Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey. Make sure to tune in tomorrow, Sunday, November 2nd at 6:30 a.m. on VOM, The Voice of Maine.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. The most important voices aren't always the loudest ones. They're the voices of everyday people, raising families, running businesses, serving their towns. That's who we want to hear from. Share your ideas with us online, and let's make sure those voices are never left out. Find us on Facebook or on X or at qpointpodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.